Welcome to another episode of Fast to Heal Stories. I am thrilled to have two guests today, and the topic is very interesting. And I know we haven't really touched on this a lot on the podcast yet after, 130 episodes. So I'm very excited to have both my guests joining me, and we don't have a lot of episodes with more than one guest either. So this will be an exciting hour. So I would like to welcome Natalie Kovarik. She's a pharmacist and a cattle rancher, and Tara Vander Dussen. She's a dairy farmer. So we are going to learn a lot about a topic we haven't talked much about. So welcome, ladies. So excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We're very excited.
Oh, good. All right. Well, let's hop right into it. Let's talk a little bit about your background and why we're even talking about regenerative ranching and regenerative farming today. Give us a little bit about your backstory and why you're so passionate about this topic.
Yeah, I'll go first, Tara here. So I am a fifth generation dairy farmer. So grew up my whole life on my family's dairy farm in New Mexico. Went away to college, got my degree in environmental science, came back, married my husband, who was a dairy farmer just down the road. And now we're raising our family on his family dairy farm. And I spent the last 10 years working as an environmental consultant for dairies throughout the Southwest. And several years ago, I started kind of sharing online, just I feel like as a lot of us did, just kind of opening up our lives online and telling people a little bit more about dairy and its impact on the environment. And along the way, met Natalie, and here we are now with our podcast Discover Ag, where we talk about, trending news topics in the ag and food space. And I'll let Natalie jump in there.
So like Tara, I grew up in agriculture. I was actually raised in Southwest Montana on a cattle ranch. I ended up, like you said, getting my degree in pharmacy. So I didn't really leave the industry, but I definitely wasn't employed in the industry. I wasn't, living on my family ranch or working on it. My income definitely was not derived from it. I met my husband, and that is how I ended up where I am now, which is in central Nebraska. We ranch down here. And so I kind of came full circle, born on a ranch, kind of left it a little bit and then ended up back on it. And like Tara said, I too started sharing online about 5 years ago, and was immediately drawn to Tara. She has a really, loud voice for the dairy industry, very intelligent, and was just early on in sharing. Not a lot of women in ag were sharing back then. And so we kind of had a fast friendship and ended up building a business together, which we love and are proud of. Like she said, we do Discover Ag every Thursday, and it's one of our favorite things to do.
Well, I love loud voices, so I'm glad I'm glad you have them. Let's talk about your docu-series a little bit. So that's also called Discover Ag. Like what is the purpose behind that? And what is your hope with what messaging are you hoping to get out on that docu-series?
Yeah, so that's something we filmed the pilot episode for last fall. We actually visited a cotton farmer in California, which was really exciting. The whole premise for Discover Ag, like you said, it's the same name as our podcast. You could kind of gather, I guess, from the name, the premise for it. We really want people to rediscover agriculture. We really want them to be, feel reconnected to their food, who's growing it, how it's grown. I think we're in a time in society where there are a lot of questions and interest around that, which is amazing. It's great that people are, wanting to kind of get reconnected to their food source. And so I think Tara and I are just really, really passionate about that. We're also really passionate about, positioning agriculture and farming and food and ranching and all those things that are foreign to people in kind of a way that doesn't feel foreign. We really want to make ag like fun and cool and exciting and sexy and like female again, and just kind of break some of those stereotypes and just give people who want to know about their food a place that's like fun for them to go to learn about it.
Yeah, that's great. And I know I was telling you before we started recording, and most of my following and listeners know that I grew up in small town Wisconsin. Like I'm talking our city's like, or the city I grew up in is like 6,000 people. It's like little rural Wisconsin and lots of farmers around. A lot of my friends lived on farms. I would love going to visit them and holding all the animals and going through their barns and learning the whole milking process. So this isn't a real foreign concept to me, but I know that there's a lot of people listening who may have never been like step foot on an actual farm or, see what all goes on behind the scenes. Some of my relatives are farmers, and they are some of the hardest workers that are out there. And I think this is just so important because there's many people who probably just have gone to the grocery store every week or order their groceries and really think nothing about where it comes from or how it's produced. And there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that people aren't aware of. So I guess I'd love to start with the whole concept of regenerative ranching, regenerative farming. You can kind of tell me which you prefer, which you like to say, what those concepts really mean. Why should we even care? Because of course, industrial agriculture is different than what we're talking about here. But what is even regenerative ranching, regenerative farming, and why should we have that on our radar?
Yeah. So I think one of the things we like to say is regenerative ag is a spectrum. It's like not a checkbox situation. And it looks different for every farm across the country. And I think that's at the core of regenerative ag is that every farmer is trying to do a little bit better than the year before and really focus on what their needs are in their local area. So for a cattle rancher in Nebraska like Natalie, it's going to be completely different than a dairy farmer in New Mexico. And it's not like a yes or no. There's just a lot of gray area and a lot of just like room for improvement. We're a conventional dairy farm, so it's not that we're organic. It's not any kind of certification, but we are trying to implement different practices that just help us. For us, conserving water is really important. We have a very limited amount of water. And so thinking about the crops that we use to feed our cows, making sure that they don't use a lot of water, they're drought tolerant, management practices in our barn. Like it's just little practices that we can change that help us just get that much closer to being more sustainable, being, passing it on to the next generation better than the way we found it.
Sure.
Yeah. So
Go ahead. I was going to ask if there's anything you wanted to add.
I was just going to say, I think at its core, regenerative farming or ranching is really about this idea of giving back, right? So there is a thought process you can go into as a rancher or farmer where you just take, right? We're just taking from the land. We're saving us our food. We're taking what we need, food, fuel, fiber. There's the idea of maybe sustainability, which some people would say is where you're kind of maintaining, right? So then it's, you're not taking, you are giving back a little bit, but it's just kind of a maintenance, right? And then there's the idea of regenerative, where in theory, like Tara mentioned, there's a bunch of different practices and things you can do as a producer to give back so that you're actually leaving it a little bit better. So you're replenishing it. You are providing more to it than you are taking back. And so if you have animals, that's looking at animal husbandry and welfare and on all the different ways that you can, better your herd. And if you're a farmer and you're running land, and even if you have animals, land is a super important part of that. It's a marriage really. But it's looking at, both land and animals as producers of what we can do to really, give back to the two really main sources that not only provide for our families and our businesses, but really to everyone nationwide.
Yeah, totally different way of thinking about agriculture for sure. And Tara, you hit on this a little bit, but I'd like to debunk a couple of myths that are out there with agriculture in general. But you had said that like restorative agriculture isn't the same necessarily as organic. Like a lot of people just think they just eat organic, like that's going to, fix all of the environmental concerns that we have. We don't need to worry about anything else as far as farming goes. So what's the difference between restorative agriculture and organic, or even this never ever, people might see that never ever treated with this or that on some branding, or even the all natural. Like that just gets confusing for the consumer. So maybe you can clear up like what the difference is a bit. And the myth that if it says all natural, never ever, or organic, that it's the same as what we're speaking about.
Yeah, Natalie and I on Discover Ag talk about labels a lot. You can't live with them, you can't live without them. Like they are
Right.
very overwhelming. They don't always mean what people think they mean. And I think, oftentimes lead to more confusion than they do anything else. But so organic is like a certification from USDA where you meet certain criteria. I think what surprises people a lot of times about organic is it's more about the farming practices and less like a health claim. If you look at like conventional milk versus organic milk, the nutrient densities, like the nutrient profile is going to be almost identical, like very, very little difference. It's more about how the product is farmed. And so I think that is, and then like, something like all natural, that label means very little, if not nothing. I mean, it's kind of just a label that makes people feel good and nothing more. And so that is kind of that one of the big things that Natalie and I believe in is food choice. No matter what food you pick, like make sure that you can feel good and confident about growing or buying it, feeding it to your family, feel good about how, those animals are raised, that crop was produced. And that's really at the core of what we believe. So, I mentioned I'm a conventional farmer. My milk goes to the most like plain old, just regular milk on the shelf, cheese on the shelf. And I want people to know they can feel good even about that choice. And that, as a conventional dairy farmer, we're still making practices to be regenerative. We're composting our manure, we're applying that manure to our fields to, really try to build up the soil. Like there's so many things that go into that.
Sure.
We
And
actually just, sorry. We actually just talked about organic a little bit, a few episodes back on our podcast. I'm not sure when this will air in comparison to where that is. I believe it's episode 82, I think, or 81. And talked about kind of the dirty dozen, because that's also associated with organic. And so if you're wanting more information or a little bit more of our 2 cents on that, that would be a good episode to go tune into.
okay. And Tara, with you being a dairy farmer, and the milk production, pasteurized versus unpasteurized, just while I'm thinking of it, can you speak to that a little bit? And I know that those are, if I'm not mistaken, I could be totally off here, but are those more state mandates or the area things that you need to be aware of? Like I don't feel like I can get pasteurized milk anywhere around my area, but is that differ from region to region? And why should people care about looking for unpasteurized milk, and if they can even, get a hold of that anywhere?
Yeah, so I actually drank raw milk almost my entire life till my first pregnancy, and then I switched to pasteurized and have stayed pasteurized, and I'm raising my girls on pasteurized milk. And so it is state based. It depends on where you're at. Obviously, I was just getting it from our dairy farm right outside my back door. So it depends on your state and what the regulations are, whether you can get it. There's a lot of myths out there about like health benefits of raw milk versus, things about pasteurized. But I think no matter what you choose, like if you're going to choose raw milk, I think you should really feel confident with your producer and know where it's coming from. And I think you also, if you choose raw milk, you have to kind of accept some of those risks, like just like as if you were eating raw steak or raw sushi, or, there is a risk associated with not cooking that food, which essentially is kind of a simplified way of explaining pasteurization is you're heating the milk to a really high temperature for about 2 seconds. And that's what pasteurization is. And then there is differences between like pasteurization and homogenization, which I think people sometimes confuse. Pasteurization is again that heating up process, and homogenization is where they like basically shake up the milk. If you don't shake up the milk, the cream will settle on top. And it's happened lots of times as I was a kid. I went to pour my cereal and didn't shake the milk and ended up with just basically heavy cream in my cereal instead of milk. And so there is different choices out there. And really you have to look into what your state allows and what the requirements are.
Sure. Have you seen a difference since you switched with the digestibility of it, or any kind of like sensitivity to the pasteurized versus un?
No, I haven't. I feel like I'm sure all the raw milk people are hoping I'm going to say something. I haven't noticed any difference at all. And one of the things with having, young kids, I didn't want to have to make that choice for like other people's children if I had kids over. The raw milk, there was just so many, there's pros and cons to both, but for our family, the pasteurization just made the most sense. And I don't notice, like I didn't think that raw milk was like this miracle worker. I think milk, no matter what one you choose, is an amazing product, super nutrient dense. It's so great for kids that they can, typically kids really like it, different dairy products. And so I'm sorry to say for all the raw milk drinkers, I've noticed no difference at all in my health.
No, I don't think I've ever been able to even purchase raw milk, but you do hear that sometimes that people can digest unpasteurized milk a little bit easier with all the enzymes that are there and the bacterias and that. But a lot of people don't know that there's even, pasteurized versus raw. So I was just curious. And I think just everything in nutrition, or almost everything, is so gray. It's like there's not any one thing, like one diet, one method, one macronutrient breakdown that's going to work for absolutely everybody. So you just have to decide like what's best for your particular body. And I tell everybody on my podcast, like, I eat dairy almost every single day. I tolerate it well. Not everybody does, but my personal body, it's a good choice for me. And like you said, it's very nutrient dense and a really great protein source. I teach my students how to meet their protein targets at every meal. And for me, dairy plays a big role, not for everybody, but for me, it definitely does. So the second myth I want to kind of debunk is the one that, regenerative agriculture requires a ton of infrastructure and it's really expensive. And, how can we even move to a state of regenerative agriculture if we have to put up all this fencing and it's going to be super expensive to convert. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit and what the pros are to, converting to more regenerative practices.
Yeah, again, I think it's important to think of regenerative just as a spectrum. So there may be operations that are going like all in 100%, and it would be more expensive for them. I think luckily we do have, organizations here on our operation. We work pretty closely with our local NRCS, which is the Natural Resource and Conservation Center. I think, is that right? Or services. And so there is, some funding to help producers who want to make some of these changes on their operations. Because you're right, it is really expensive, and ranching and farming is already capital intensive and pretty slim margins to begin with. And so it is a lot to ask a producer maybe who wants to make these changes, but can't feasibly from a monetary standpoint. And so we are getting to a place where I think there are some organizations that are starting to kind of maybe put that at the forefront. I know our farm bill is like pushing some of the money into it, but that, opens up a bigger can of worm, which we have talked about before on the podcast, is there is lack of funding in agriculture to begin with. For as important of an industry is, we really don't see a lot of dollars, even, comes to, we just got off talking about like food, and a lot of the trials are hard to do because one, it's, hard to control everything when it comes to, humans eating foods and maintaining all the other variables, but it's just hard to put funding into science, these studies to begin with. And so, and that was a little bit of a tangent from your question, but I think the important thing to do with regenerative ag is that there is a scale. So producers can start small and make these changes that wouldn't be as capital intensive, or they can try and find, some organizations to help them maybe go all in, where they're more regenerative than they would be viewed as conventional, I guess, from society standards.
Sure. Is there anything you wanted to add, Tara?
Yeah, no, I think, it goes back to the fact that in my mind, in regenerative, like, it isn't about doing everything all at once. And sometimes it's a little bit of trial and error to figure out, like, I know when we were experimenting with new drought tolerant crops, like, it wasn't just like a one and done, like, here we go, this is the crop and we're going to plant it everywhere. It was like, okay, let's try one half circle, see how it does this year. Okay, it did good this year, like next year, then, the third year was like, well, what did we learn from year two? And how can it's just not like a switch that you flip, like, it's not an on and off. And some of it does take time, as we've incorporated, more minimal till into our farming, where we're not like tilling up the land as much. There's times we do have to still till for different reasons. Like in farming, you've got Mother Nature always like coming in and changing things for you. And so it's just kind of like that progress of seeing what worked, what didn't, and what you can continue on the next year.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the way Tara said progress is actually really important. Our operation, we've always done cover crops, which would be considered like a regenerative practice. But we've always just kind of done it basic, right? Like, we've got rye as a common one, which a lot of listeners may not know what I'm talking about, but that is going to be a very common, plant you can put in the ground to be considered a cover crop. And now that we are kind of choosing to delve more into it, we're looking at maybe getting more customized ones that are built, specifically for our operation, that are a little bit more personalized and just not, so generic. And so Tara's right, there's this spectrum. We keep going back to that. And there's also this time component. We feel like we've done a good job with where we are with cover crops, and now we're ready to kind of amp it to the next level. But we didn't just do that, overnight on our operation.
Sure. Well, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about soil and how that relates to nutrition, because it's so frustrating because you point your students in the direction of eating better, eating whole foods, eating things that come straight from the farm or straight from the tree or the ground. But it's frustrating because they just don't have the same nutritional value as they did couple hundred years ago, 1,000 years ago, because the soil has been changed basically and depleted of nutrients. So can you talk about a little bit about how regenerative ag can help to restore what we've done basically to the soil, and how these farming methods can help to restore some of the nutrition back to the soils, because it's a huge problem. It's like, even if you're eating well, you might not be getting as much nutrition as you think you are.
Yeah, so this is a little out of my wheelhouse because we are pretty cattle intensive and less farming. We have a little bit of farm ground that we lease out. But you're right. I always say we've gotten to where we are as a food system for a reason. So we didn't just accidentally end up here, right? If you kind of go through the history of food or agriculture, we have had to make changes for certain reasons. Some of them were, industrialization changed a lot of things. We also got to a point when, farmers weren't really making any money. And so the government was stepping in to kind of help them from a standpoint. We also got to a point where there was major concerns of food security. And so changes were made to agriculture for that too. So we kind of ended up where we are. I think what you're referring to when you talk about the soil is that, now we're in a time in agriculture where we're having to put more resources back into the soil to maintain it even, so we're using fertilizers much more than we were, historically when we were small central and local food systems. We've also kind of removed the grazing animal, which is why, one of Tara and I's soapbox that we get on a lot is when people are on an anti-meat narrative, they really aren't understanding the implications of what removing grazing animals do, because they are key. There's 5 principles to soil health, and grazing animals is one of the principles. And so we really have to kind of get back to, implementing them into kind of, I guess, agriculture, the cycle of it. So yeah, I mean, our soils, I heard, I know there's that, a statement out there that we have, like, I don't even know what it is, 30 harvests left or 40 or some number that's all we have left. That's actually been debunked. So I think our soils, I don't want to say they're good or bad. I guess they're just in a different place than they were. But again, we got here because we had more mouths to feed. And as Americans, we're lucky that we don't have to spend a ton of money. We have a safe, affordable, abundant food system. And part of that is the progression of agriculture. But I guess to circle back around, there are things we are doing to better take care of our soil, which are these regenerative practices. We've already mentioned, cover crops is a huge one. The grazing animals is a huge one. So farmers and ranchers are aware and are, implementing, again, different things for their different area and what their operations look like. But they really are focusing. Soil health is a topic at almost every single ag conference that Tara and I attend to. There's a lot of attention on what we can do to better, position our soils.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that. Soils are like a living organism, basically. That's kind of how you have to think about it. And I feel like maybe to put you and like your listeners at ease, I feel like it's not as like doom and gloom as sometimes we see in the media with like the nutritional differences and different foods from then, versus now and those kind of things. I think in a lot of ways we're headed in a really good direction. There's a lot of exciting things happening in ag. And with thinking about soil as that like living organism, one of the ways that you can improve soil is by improving organic matter. And one of the fastest ways to do that is incorporate cow manure. And on our dairy farm, our cows are in pens, like in corrals. It's called an open lot. So they aren't grazing. Dairy is a little bit different than that in the beef world. Those are kind of separate. But what we're able to do is actually compost all of our manure. I mentioned that. And my husband likes to say it's like kind of like a closed loop system. So if we have a farmer that we buy feed from to feed our cattle, a lot of times It's literally like a truck of feed coming in from the farmer's field, and we're sending a truck out with cow manure going to their field. So like what we're taking out of the soil to feed our cows, we hope we're giving back to them in fertilizer, natural fertilizer of cow manure. And so it's kind of cool to see that kind of like transaction of essentially nutrients to feed the cows, nutrients to feed the soils, and going back and forth. And it's just a really great way to incorporate, a waste product like manure, not everyone's favorite topic, but it can be so vital for the nutrients in the soil.
Yeah, and where I live, we call them the poop trucks. Hide
Yeah.
them sometimes, and in the spring and in the fall, right in our subdivision, there's a big field, and a couple times a year, you see the poop truck go in there, and it's smelly, but it's like, well, I would rather have that as a natural fertilizer, and rather than you don't see all of the spray. Thankfully, I don't see the sprays. I'm like, oh, I don't want sprays on the field right next to where I'm drinking out of my own well. So we just call them the poop trucks. Like, oh, it's that time of the year. They're just going down the road, and you open your windows and it smells for a few days, but it's a good thing to put up with.
Yeah, you mentioned water, and I'm glad you did. You say like the water I'm drinking. Well, the tank that gives our cows water is the same tank that gives my house water. And so I feel like that's something always important to remember is like farmers live on their farms, like drink the water below their land, like are a part of the land just as much as all of us. And so like protecting our natural resources, like our water, is just as crucial. Like it's just as important of a thing for us as it is for you guys. And I feel like sometimes that part of the conversation gets missed, like I want the water to be protected for my kids. And so obviously we're going to length in order to ensure that we're protecting water, that we're protecting soil health. And it's just kind of a day-to-day thing for us, that it's a part of our life that we are like integrally, I totally butchered that word, involved in like our land and our natural resources. Like it's just a part of our everyday life.
Mhm. Yeah. And you talked, one of you said something about lack of funding. I think it was Natalie, but that's always a huge problem in so many realms. But um, it's like you think about government subsidies, and most subsidies are, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's cotton, sugar, wheat, corn, soy. Do you think that we're going to start to shift away from that? And that's why we have so many foods with those ingredients. Like you pick up probably 80% of the foods in a grocery store, and they have a combination of most of those ingredients. If they're processed, they're, not coming straight from a farm. But do you see a movement with that changing at all? Like changing the subsidies? Because you said there's not a lot of funding to, eggs and dairy and meat. And it's just all to these monocrops, because that's what the government subsidizes. And I know this is a huge topic, but have you seen any shifts in that? And, how important that is to change our whole food system?
I've actually asked my husband this very question within like the last 2 weeks, because we were talking a little bit on our podcast, and it's something I'm actually diving more into myself and learning a ton about. Again, I grew up on a cattle ranch, and we cattle ranch now. So I've kind of always just not stayed out of the farming, but I guess, I don't know. I've just never really been as interested in it as I am now. Subsidies are really interesting. I've always heard that if you're getting a simple answer for a complex topic, you're probably not getting the full picture. And for me, that always boils down to like everything in agriculture. So there are pros and cons to subsidies. Again, we got to the point where we are with subsidies for a reason. When I was talking about my husband, and this just is our personal discussion, I am not an expert in the farming industry, but I don't see a shift, at least probably not within the next 10 to 15 years, at least in agriculture, away from subsidies. And you are correct. It is only to some of those larger certain crops. I think, if you delve into them, there are certainly pros or cons against them. I think one of the things that's important to play into to the discussion and why my husband and I ultimately decided that we wouldn't see a major shift in the way subsidies are right now is food security. So you look at, what happened with Ukraine and Russia, or what happened with COVID. I was listening to a podcast where someone was in Aruba and she was talking about how she was so afraid that she actually was not going to be feed her family because they rely so heavily on importation. And subsidies give us food security, I think, as a nation. So I don't know if that answered your question the way you wanted to, but I just don't see it. Like you said, it's a very big thing in agriculture. And I don't mean, that's a bad way to explain it, big. It's so integrated so deeply, right? Like it is such a part of agriculture right now that to change it just at the snap of the fingers, I'm not sure we're at that point yet. And from a food security standpoint, I'm not sure the government is at a place where they want to make those changes yet, I guess.
Yeah. Subsidies is complicated too, because there's varying levels. Like there's like crop insurance, like if your crop fails. And in my mind, like I feel like the root of that was such in a good place. Like if a natural disaster happens and a farmer loses his entire crop, you don't want that farmer to go out of business because of one bad year. Like Natalie said, this is about food security. You want the farmers to still be around the next year to produce food for us. You want that to be like passed on year after year. And so if one bad year you were to wipe out an entire area of farmers, that's problematic. And then there's differing levels. I think people throw around the word subsidies without fully understanding all that it is. And it is different for cattle versus cropping. People think of ag as like lumping it all together when it's very segregated, like very different in different sections. And so one thing, dairy has recently kind of redone our like kind of insurance basically. And what we have is the margin protection program. So it's basically you buy insurance. And so if the margins, like how much profit you're going to make, falls below a certain level for whatever you purchase, like you put money into it, then you get like a return. And it's not perfect, but I feel like it's gotten a little better than where it was at. Like I remember growing up, my dad always would talk like badly about the dairy system. And so I feel like this is a little bit better system, but I kind of like that idea. It's ensuring that the farmer has an income, that there is a profit margin if they pay for the insurance. I hope that makes sense. I know Natalie and I are kind of rambling on this topic.
Complex issue. And it's so many things. It's like people ask me questions about nutrition. I'm like, it's not a yes or no, or do this, or, I mean, it's so gray and it's so different from person to person, but these are very complex issues that we've never talked about on the podcast before. And there's, not one definitive answer, but yeah, subsidies play a huge role into what we're eating. And like we mentioned, it's like so many people just walk into the grocery store, put things in their cart, don't think anything about where things are coming from, why, certain ingredients are pushed so heavily. And like you said, you don't want, the last thing you want is a farmers to be hurt. You want them they're integral to our whole system and our whole community, but they're really complex issues. So I'm glad we're talking about them. One last myth I'd like to kind of debunk, and then maybe we can let Natalie talk about, whatever we didn't talk about with the cattle ranching before we leave, and then Tara, whatever it is that you wanted to make sure people knew about the dairy industry. But one thing that people are always saying that I know comes up a lot too is like, we need the mega farms, or we need the industrial agriculture to produce enough food to feed the world. Like when we touched on this a little bit, but do you know like what percentage of like the foods and whatever it is that's coming from farms is coming from more like the small family owned farms versus the industrial mega farms? And do you think we could shift away from the mega farms and still be able to feed everybody, or is that a real problem?
Yeah, so I can start here. I think for dairy, it's 97% of all dairy farms in the United States are family owned and operated. And so I'll start with that. And then the second part I'll say is I feel like by probably most accounts, people would probably call my family farm a factory farm just because of the number of cattle we have. And I hate that word, obviously, because I live about 100 steps from my milking barn. So I don't know how much more family it could be. And so I feel like sometimes people have a understanding, like they want to place a number, and I always ask, like, what is that number? What makes you a small farm? What makes you a big farm? And it's, again, really regional. Like you mentioned, you're from Wisconsin. Wisconsin dairy farming looks incredibly different than New Mexico dairy farming. New Mexico dairy farming, like our cows are outdoors 365 days a year because our climate allows it. Wisconsin, probably not the case. I'm sure you guys have seen snow this year. We have seen like very little snow. And so it's just, I think it's different. I wish, like, this is one of those moments where I wish everyone could come out to a farm and see it, because I think once you see it, you leave with a different perspective. It also is more complicated. So when I was a kid, I always, like, my dad always talked about, like, he went out on his own. That's like the quote, you'd go out on your own. Like, you would get a farm separate from your parents or from your siblings. So my uncle had a farm, my grandfather had a farm, my dad had a farm. That is not the farming I live in nowadays with dairy farming. We farm with my father-in-law and 4 out of 5 of my husband's brothers. So there is a ton of us on the farm, and we have decided to all stay together on one farm in order to just kind of help each other out. Like, economies of scale is real. It also, like, people probably don't think about this, but if you milk cows every single day, twice a day, 365 days a year, there's very little downtime, very little vacation. Us sticking together makes it so that my brother-in-laws, my husband, have a lot more flexibility on what their schedule looks like. And so it's going to be one of those conversations is very nuanced, and there's a lot of gray area. And that's on the dairy side. I'll let Natalie get into the beef side because I think she has some really great stats too.
Yeah. So again, I think we are smaller than most people would assume. The average herd size of a beef cattle ranch is actually only 43, which is pretty tiny. Again, people would look at how many we're running, which were well into the multiple hundreds. And so we'd be considered, big, bad, large. But it's just my husband and I and one full-time employee. It's literally it. So this idea that a number is associated with, well, like I said, big is bad and small is better is just not true. There could be bigger practices that are maybe doing a better job than a smaller one. And maybe the opposite, maybe smaller is better than some of the bigger. It really comes down to like management practices. And that, I think that's more important than when it comes to a number. As far as, getting back to a society, maybe stepping away from larger operations and going, maybe to like a more local food system, I guess would be the opposite of that. Again, I'm not saying it's not doable. They're just such big changes to the way the food system is. Employment is a really big one. We already have a hard enough time getting employment in the ag industry as it is. So to shift away from, bigger operations that have the funds or the scaling or whatever it is to make it more sustainable than, a ton of small ones. I'm not sure, like Tara mentioned, how many people want to go back to milking their own milk cows, or, it would change consumer habits. So a lot of things would shift. So I don't have the answer as to whether, which way we're going as a society. I do think there's a big push, people, as we said at the beginning of the podcast, people are much more in tune with where their food is coming from. They have a lot more voices. They're voicing their concerns about it. They're asking more questions about it. So I do think there's this movement away from what people are picturing, but I'm not sure they have a full understanding of what they're picturing. Sometimes I think they're picturing something much more worse than what's out there in agriculture. Again, going back to the beef industry, the average herd size is 43, and there's a beef cow changes ownership 5 different times before it actually ends up on your plate. So it truly is a group of families that are running it. I'm fine with people saying factory farm when they get to the processing. Like if you want to look at the Cargills that are, the packing plants, like for sure, that's probably considered a factory. But as far as everything before that, which is, the animal's life, essentially, that's going to be ran by family ranchers across the U.S. That is not, and that's not me sugarcoating it or trying to position it in a good light. That truly is a fact. It is a bunch of different family operations coming together to get it to the processing plant, which again, you could call a factory if you want.
I'll add one thing that I didn't say to that is that I love to share is that dairy, if you buy the plain old regular whole milk on the shelf at the grocery store, it typically comes from a farm less than 100 miles from your location, and it gets there within 48 hours. So like Natalie said, like, I think it's actually smaller and more localized than people think. Like, one of our most local foods is like beef and dairy. We're not importing them from other countries. Like, there's a lot of small family farms across the country providing these foods. And so I hope that makes some people, like, I don't know, puts people at ease, puts their mind at ease, and maybe makes them, I don't know, excited about beef and dairy.
Yeah, Natalie, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's like our food system is consumer driven, but you have to be an educated consumer
Yeah.
in order to make choices and drive the choices. So it's, you know, in the nutrition field, in the health fields, like there's so much misinformation out there. So like you want to make good choices, you want to make good choices for your family, your children, and it is consumer driven, but you know, getting the proper information is critical in the first place. So Natalie, anything you wanted to add about cattle ranching in general, questions that I didn't ask that you'd really love the listeners to hear about? My listeners struggle with insulin resistance and chronic disease and blood sugar issues and, you know, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, that sort of thing. So what do you want them to know about cattle ranching? I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about this. Is a whole other podcast, but, you know, red meat and how it drives disease and all of that. And I don't know if you even want to touch on that, but what else do you want people to know about cattle ranching and, you know, education that you would like to share?
Yeah. Well, first off, if you have a ton of questions and you feel like want a source to go to, just come follow me online. I share what's going on my ranch every single day. My handle's Natalie Kovarik, and I am not the only one doing this too. So you could also find, if you are in, maybe you want to follow a rancher or a farmer in your state, I could probably easily connect you with someone that you could, start getting eyes on what we're doing every single day. I think if there's anyone tuning in that maybe wants meat on their plate but feels guilty about it from an environmental standpoint, I really want to reassure you that that is a narrative that is blown completely out of control. If you look at the numbers, uh, agriculture as a whole accounts for less, what is it, Tara? Less than, why am I blanking on this?
11% of total greenhouse gas emissions.
And then animals themselves is down, it's less than 4, it's like 3 point something percent. And so when people are saying that, cows are worse than cars, or, cows are the most destructive thing we can do to the planet, the numbers really are not there to support it. And that's just from a number standpoint. The other part of the conversation that no one gets into is all the good things cattle can do. And I kind of alluded to this earlier in the conversation, but they are so important for a grazing animal, is so important for soil health. And we already talked about how important soil health is as a nation moving forward. It's one of the ways that we can actually pull carbon from the air. So if you really care about, greenhouse gas emissions and warming or looking at global footprints, it's like we have to keep a ruminant animal out there because they are going to be key to our soils. They're also, we haven't touched on byproducts, but cattle are really, really good at taking what other people are wasting and then consuming them and turning them into protein. And again, it's a really cool system that agriculture set up in. Cattle can take cellulose grass, obviously, and turn it into meat, but they also take things like, citrus peels and almond hulls and cotton seeds and all these things that every other industry would throw away, which again would eventually add to the carbon footprint. But instead they get to consume it, and then they keep other industries' footprints down. And then they also turn that into beef for us. So if you want to put meat on your plate, I hope you leave this conversation knowing, one, that there's a family behind that meat, whether you sourced it from a local rancher, which I am 100% supportive of, or if you got it from the grocery store, there was still families that were involved in that process. So feel good about it from that standpoint, and then also feel good about it from an environmental standpoint, because anyone who's saying that the answer to our climate problems are getting rid of cows, they really have a very bad, poor understanding of the whole process and what would happen if we removed animals and animals' actual role when it comes to environmental issues.
Those are all great points. And I'm glad you brought up the greenhouse emissions. That was on my list of things to ask about and set people straight about, because that has been completely blown out of proportion. And whether or not you choose to eat meat or not, I mean, like you said, if you take ruminants off out of the equation, I mean, we would have a massive problem. And I didn't know all of the things that they would eat. And like you said, they turn things into protein, and they, a lot of people think, like, if I eat fat, I'm going to store fat. It's like, you look at a cattle or cow, it's like they don't eat much fat, but yet they can convert it into saturated fat. And that's what we get to eat. We get to eat the protein in the saturated fat, which is packed full of good nutrition. So it's just interesting to think about, and how you can recycle so many things. What about you, Tara? What do you want people, what I didn't ask about with dairy farming, what do you want people to know, like to really come away from this podcast being educated about things, myths that are out there, things that you wanted to debunk?
Yeah. So, if you follow up kind of what Natalie said a lot of things I was going to touch. She stole all of the things actually I was going to say. So I'll have to go in a different direction. But if you have questions about dairy, you can follow me at Tara Vander Dussen. I answer all my DMs and try to get to people's questions. I've been seeing a lot of questions about, hormones and antibiotics in milk, which I feel like is always a hot topic. And I just feel like, rest assured, there are no antibiotics, no added hormones in any milk on the shelf, no matter what you buy. And I think that's maybe the point I want people to leave this podcast knowing is, no matter what beef or dairy you choose at the grocery store, like, you can feel really good about its safety and nutritional value. Like, those are some of the two most nutrient dense foods that we can put on our plate. And so no matter which food, which brand is within your budget, or where you're able to source, your meat and your dairy from, you should feel really good about putting that on your plate, serving that to your family, because of all of the things, we've talked about the nutrition and the environment and how it's grown and how it's raised and the families behind it. And so I just hope people kind of leave, I think, being more confident in their buying choices and feeling good about those.
Yeah, great. Those are all amazing points. I'm glad you brought all of that up. I think I had answered everything I had questions about, and we're hearing the answers straight from the people who are on the front lines with all of this. So I'm so happy you were able to come on. So you shared your Instagram handles, and then you have your docu-series Discover Ag, you have your podcast Discover Ag. Does the docu-series is that just kind of ongoing, or is there other places we can find you as well?
You can find our Discover Ag Instagram page at discoverag_. And there will be more coming from the docu-series, but right now the best place to find us is on that podcast and on our Instagram channels.
Okay, we will be sure to link to everything in the show notes. I know I've listened to several podcast episodes, and they're very interesting. I haven't watched the docu-series yet, any of the episodes. There's a couple out at the time of this recording, but hoping to make some time to watch those as well. But thank you for all that you do, and getting the information out that you do. There's not a ton of people who have the knowledge base that you both have. So thanks so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for letting us come on and share with your community.
All right, I just got to stop recording.